and welcome. I am so glad that you're joining us today. We're starting a brand new series called Together. And I want you to know that God created us to live connected with Him. He's always with us, so we never have to face things alone. Today we're going to talk about a Moabite woman named Ruth, and we'll see in her story that God was always with her. We find her story in the Bible in a book called Ruth. Ruth's story begins with a man from Judah named Elimelech, who had moved away from his hometown of Bethlehem because of a famine. There was not enough food for him to feed his family, so he moved them to Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. They settled there and built their lives, but years later, Elimelech died. And his wife Naomi was left with her 2 sons, who by that point had married Moabite women. And one of those women's name was Ruth, and the other was Orpah. Now, after 10 years, Naomi's 2 sons also died, leaving their wives widows as well. Now, this was a really big deal because in those times, the men in the household were the main providers, and women really struggled providing for themselves and their family if there was no husband or son or brother to help them. And that's when Naomi decided to return to her hometown of Bethlehem because the famine had passed. Let's read the conversation that she had with her daughters-in-law on the way to their homeland. But on the way, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. "No," they said, "we want to go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Why should you go on with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No. My daughters, return to your parents' home, for I am too old to marry again, and even if it were possible and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord Himself has raised His fist against me." And again, they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. "Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same." But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." Ruth 1, 9 through 17. So here we see Naomi doing the right thing by asking her daughters-in-law to return to their homes with their parents. Orpah returned home after weeping and said goodbye to Naomi, but Ruth did not want to leave. She clung to Naomi, and not only to her, but to her God and her ways. Ruth decided that she was going to follow God wherever He would lead the 2 of them. They arrived in Bethlehem, and Ruth set out to find some food for herself and her mother-in-law. She went out to the fields to see if she could find a landowner that would allow her to pick up the small remnants of the grain that the harvesters had left behind, so that she and Naomi would have a little food to eat. And this was a common practice at that time, and landowners would usually allow those in need of food to come and glean the leftovers from the fields. Well, as it turned out, Ruth ended up in a field that belonged to Boaz, who was a relative of her father-in-law Elimelech. And Boaz was a good man, and Ruth found favor with him. And so he allowed her to pick grain from his field. He even instructed his workers to watch out for Ruth and to intentionally drop extra grain so that she and Naomi would have plenty to eat. Ruth worked in Boaz's field, and Boaz was very generous to Ruth. The day came when Naomi advised Ruth to approach Boaz, since he was a close relative of theirs, to see if he would step in as their kinsman redeemer. Now, according to the law and custom of God's people in that day, the kinsman redeemer was a male relative who had the privilege or responsibility to act on behalf of a relative who was in trouble, in danger, or in need. And Boaz fulfilled that role and married Ruth, and God blessed them with a son who they named Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of King David. And from King David's lineage, the Messiah, God's son, Jesus, was born. Now, I want you to stop and think about that for a moment. How incredible this story is. Better than any fairy tale princess story. Ruth is a widowed Moabite woman, and she ends up being the great-great-grandmother of Jesus, the Savior of the entire world. Now, Ruth is an example of how God can completely transform a life and take it in the direction that he's purposed. And we see God working his perfect plan in Ruth's life, just as he does with all of us, with you and me. Now, although Ruth had come from this pagan background in Moab, once she met the God of Israel, she became a living testimony to him because of her faith. Ruth did not know, but God had already written her story and her purpose, and God had chosen her from birth to be in the genealogy of Jesus. Ruth's life was part of God's plan, and he was with her through everything. And God is always with you and I too. Ruth went through loss and grief, and we see that God comforted her. And she arrived with nothing in a foreign country, no job, but God provided. And God was with her every moment of her life. And Ruth clung to God, and he took care of everything else. This brings us to our memory verse for this month in our new series together. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 8. And it says this: "Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord will personally go ahead of you. He will be with you. He will neither fail you nor abandon you." These words were written before Ruth was born, but she took them and she believed them in her heart that God would always go before her. And today I encourage you to embrace this truth and know that he will never abandon you. Our key point today is that I want you to always remember is this, that God is with me. This is also true, just as he was with Naomi, and he was with Ruth, and he was with David. He is always and will always be with you.